That godforsaken metal monstrosity has to come down, Major Callahan, and it has to come down by Friday, or the fines will be $1,000 a day, retroactive to the date of installation. The voice belonged to Karen Vance, president of the Northgate Estates Homeowners Association, a woman whose physical presence was as imposing as her sense of entitlement. She stood on my freshly sodded lawn, her floral-print muumuu straining against the humid Carolina air, one hand planted firmly on a hip that seemed to have its own gravitational pull, the other clutching a clipboard like a scepter. Her face, a mask of righteous indignation flushed pink from the effort of walking the 30 yards from her own driveway, was framed by a helmet of peroxide-blonde hair that hadn't moved since the Reagan administration. Behind me, rising from a newly poured concrete base near the side of my house, was the object of her fury, a 40-foot telescoping aluminum tower, currently retracted to a modest 20 feet, supporting a multi-band Yagi antenna and a discone VHF-UHF array. To her, it was a monstrosity. To me, it was a lifeline, a complex instrument of communication that represented the culmination of my 30-year career in the Army's Signal Corps and the cornerstone of my new life as a federal contractor. It was the reason I'd bought this specific half-acre lot, chosen for its elevation and clear line of sight. And I had the paperwork, thick as a phone book, to prove its legality, its necessity, and its federal protection. But I had a feeling none of that would matter to the woman currently treating my property like a hostile beachhead. This is the kind of story that makes your blood boil. And if you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board member, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss how this plays out. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what your own HOA nightmare story is. We're all in this together. Now back to Karen and her declaration of war on my front lawn. I had retired from the Army less than 6 months prior, trading my major's oak leaves for the quiet promise of civilian life. My wife Sarah and I had chosen this community specifically for its peace and quiet, a place to decompress after 3 decades of moving every few years. The house was perfect, a solid brick rancher on a corner lot with enough space for my workshop and, most importantly, for the equipment I needed for my new contract with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. My job was simple in concept, but complex in execution. In the event of a catastrophic failure of local infrastructure, a hurricane, a massive ice storm, a solar flare, you name it, my station was designated as a primary communications hub for the entire region. I was the guy who made sure first responders could talk to each other when the cell towers were down and the internet was a distant memory. The antennas Karen was sneering at weren't for pirate radio or chatting with aliens. They were designed to link paramedics to hospitals, firefighters to command centers, and National Guard units to state emergency operations. It was a solemn responsibility, one I took as seriously as any command I'd ever held. Before a single shovel of dirt was turned for the concrete base, I had done my due diligence. I had a file an inch thick, FCC licenses, federal preemption statutes like the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and the FCC's own PRB1 rule, which severely limits the ability of local ordinances or HOA covenants to restrict amateur and, by extension, emergency radio operations. I had a structural engineering report on the tower's wind load capacity and a letter from my FEMA regional director outlining the critical public safety nature of my station. I had even, as a courtesy, submitted a summary of my plans to the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, not for permission, but for notification. I received a form letter back, a checked box next to approved, signed it with an illegible scrawl. I'd assumed naively that would be the end of it. I had underestimated the awesome bureaucratic power of a bored woman with a title. I looked from the antenna array, its clean aluminum lines gleaming in the afternoon sun, back to Karen's furious, puffing face. I took a slow breath, the way I'd learned to in countless tense situations overseas, letting the adrenaline settle before I spoke. Karen, I began, keeping my voice level and calm. I appreciate you coming over to express your concerns. However, this installation is a federally licensed and protected communications facility. It's not coming down. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits, her face darkening. Don't you Karen me, mister, I'm President Vance. And I don't care if you have a letter from the President of the United States himself. Our covenants state, and I quote, no external antennas, satellite dishes larger than 1 meter, or other unsightly structures shall be erected without express written consent of the board. You do not have our consent. She tapped the clipboard with a perfectly manicured blood-red fingernail. That approval you got was for a flagpole. That's what your little form said. Not this eyesore. A lie. A blatant, easily disprovable lie. My submission had included the full schematics, the tower model number, and a link to the manufacturer's website. I had the carbon copy right inside in my file. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a power play. And in that moment, standing on my own property, a property I'd paid for with a lifetime of service, I felt a familiar switch flip in my mind. The quiet retiree was gone, and Major Callahan was back on duty. This was no longer about a simple disagreement over aesthetics. This was about a bully who had mistaken my quiet professionalism for weakness. And she was about to learn, in excruciating detail, just how wrong she was. This was my hill, and I was prepared to defend it. The first official salvo arrived 3 days later, delivered by a certified mail carrier who seemed vaguely apologetic as he handed me the crisp, cream-colored envelope. Inside, on heavy letterhead embossed with the Northgate Estates Eagle logo, an eagle that looked more like a startled chicken, was a formal notice of violation. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic passive aggression, typed in a stern Times New Roman font. It cited Bylaw Article 7, Section 4, Aesthetic Harmony, a clause so vague and subjective it could be used to outlaw garden gnomes or a slightly off-color welcome mat. The letter, signed with a flourish by Karen Vance, president, and countersigned by a Mildred Perkins, secretary, informed me that I was being fined an initial $250 for the unapproved structure, and that, as she had promised, daily fines of $1,000 would begin accruing if the offending apparatus was not removed within 48 hours. It also helpfully informed me that failure to pay these fines would result in a lien being placed upon my property. It was a declaration of total war, written on stationery. My first instinct, the old soldier's instinct, was to launch a full frontal assault, to march down to her house with my binder of evidence and have a very loud, very public discussion. But my training took over. You don't win a war like this with shock and awe. You win it with logistics, intelligence, and overwhelming, soul-crushing paperwork. So I went to my office and began to assemble my counteroffensive. I pulled out the Karen file, a new hanging folder I'd created the day of our confrontation. Inside went the certified letter. Then I pulled out my own files. I made high-quality color copies of everything. My FCC license, the letter from FEMA Regional Director Michaels, the full text of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, highlighting the sections on federal preemption. I printed out the FCC's own public-facing webpage explaining PRB1 and the limited authority of HOAS over amateur radio installations. I included the structural engineer's report, which certified the tower could withstand 120-mile-per-hour winds, a fact I was sure would be of interest to our hurricane-prone community. I even included my original submission to the Architectural Review Committee and the stamped approved form letter I'd received back. I wrote a cover letter, polite but firm, addressed to the Northgate Estates HOA Board of Directors. I deliberately addressed it to the entire board, not just Karen, forcing her to either share it or actively conceal it from her colleagues, an act which would have its own legal ramifications. In the letter, I calmly and methodically refuted each of their points. I explained the public safety mandate of my station. I cited the specific federal laws that superseded their aesthetic harmony clause. I pointed out that their own committee had, in fact, approved the plan. I concluded by stating, while I am more than happy to discuss reasonable accommodations, such as landscaping to minimize the visual impact from the street, the removal of this federally protected critical infrastructure is and will remain non-negotiable. I consider this matter closed. I packaged the entire thick bundle of documents into a large manila envelope and drove to the post office. I sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested, addressed to the HOA's official mailing address, a P.O. box at the local strip mall. The electronic click of the postage meter stamping the label was deeply satisfying. Phase 1 was complete. I had established a clear, undeniable paper trail. I had presented my evidence in a professional manner. I had given them a clear and easy off-ramp to de-escalate the situation. Now I would wait and see if they were smart enough to take it. The answer came a week later, not in the mail, but in the form of a second letter, this one taped to my front door. It was another violation notice, this time for failure to comply. The original $250 fine was now listed as past due, and the daily fines had brought the total to a ludicrous $7,250. Tucked behind the notice was a single sheet of paper, a memo from Karen. It was breathtaking in its arrogance. "Mr. Callahan," it read, "we are in receipt of your package of irrelevant documents. Our covenants are the law in this community, not your fake government papers. The HOA board stands united. The fines will continue. We advise you to retain legal counsel." It was signed simply, K. Vance, President. The phrase fake government papers was what did it. It was a level of willful ignorance so profound it was almost impressive. She hadn't just ignored my evidence, she had dismissed it as a fabrication. She hadn't consulted the HOA's lawyer. If she had, any halfway competent attorney would have told her to stand down immediately. This was all her. This was pure ego. And the board stands united? I seriously doubted it. It was far more likely she'd told the other members, the timid Mildred Perkins, and probably a couple of other retirees who just wanted to oversee the pool maintenance budget, that she had it handled. I walked back to my office, the memo in my hand, and a cold, calm resolve settled over me. She had refused the off-ramp. She had chosen escalation. Fine. If we were going to war, I was going to make sure I had the best intelligence and the strongest alliances. I opened a fresh document on my computer and typed, "Project Retribution, Phase 2, Reconnaissance and Alliance Building." The quiet life could wait. Major Callahan had a new mission. The first step in any campaign is to know the terrain and the enemy. I spent the next several evenings after dinner taking long, leisurely strolls through the neighborhood, my friendly golden retriever, Charlie, trotting happily beside me. It was the perfect cover. No one looks twice at a guy walking his dog, but I wasn't just enjoying the sunset, I was conducting a detailed survey. I carried a small notepad and made discreet notes on my phone. I was looking for violations of Article 7, Section 4, aesthetic harmony, and I found them everywhere. Karen's own house, number 1428 Azalea Lane, was a goldmine. She had a collection of at least a dozen ceramic gnomes engaged in what looked like a drunken brawl in her front flower bed. The bylaws specifically prohibited lawn ornaments of a whimsical or distracting nature. She had a pink plastic flamingo, its leg ironically broken, peeking out from behind a rose bush. She had wind chimes that tinkled incessantly, a direct violation of the noise ordinance section. Her mailbox, painted a garish shade of teal to match her shutters, violated the rule requiring all mailboxes to be a uniform, black or bronze. I took time-stamped photos of it all. I moved on. 3 houses down, the Henderson family had a basketball hoop at the end of their driveway. It was portable, but it had clearly been there for months, judging by the rust on its base. A clear violation. The Garcias at the end of the cul-de-sac had a small vegetable garden in their front yard. A technical breach of the front lawns must be exclusively grass and approved shrubbery rule. Old Mr. Abernathy, a widower in his 80s, had a small, tasteful ramp leading to his front door for his walker, which had never been submitted to the Architectural Review Committee. I documented it all. Every unapproved shed, every slightly too tall fence, every boat parked in a driveway for more than the allowed 24 hours. Within a week, I had a thick file of documented, photographed, and cross-referenced violations, a comprehensive map of the community's systemic hypocrisy. The rules were not for everyone. The rules were a weapon, and Karen wielded it only against those she wished to control. My next step was to identify potential allies. I started with the most obvious target. A house on the next street over, owned by a man named Dave Jensen, had a flagpole. Not a small decorative one, but a proper 25-foot pole set in concrete. He flew a large American flag, and beneath it, the black POW MyA flag. I'd noticed it on my first drive through the neighborhood. I'd also noticed a small laminated notice from the HOA zip-tied to the pole. I timed my walk to pass by when Dave was out mowing his lawn. He was a big guy, mid-40s, with a high and tight haircut and a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm. I stopped, let Charlie sniff his immaculate lawn, and struck up a conversation. "That's a fine-looking flag," I said, nodding toward the pole. He shut off the mower and wiped his brow. "Thanks. The HOA seems to disagree." He gestured at the notice. "Says it's over the 20-foot height limit for structures, and the flag itself is larger than the approved decorative size. They've been fining me $50 a month for 6 months. I'm Jack Callahan, just moved in over on Oak Street." We shook hands. His grip was like a vice. "Dave Jensen, you're the guy with the big antenna, right? Heard Karen's on a warpath about that." The neighborhood grapevine was efficient, it seemed. "That's me," I said with a wry smile. "She's up to $1,000 a day on my fines." Dave let out a low whistle. "1,000? That woman's out of her mind. What are you going to do?" "I'm fighting it," I said, "and I'm looking for other people who've been on the receiving end of her selective enforcement." I told him about my project, about the photos, the documentation, the blatant hypocrisy of her own violations. As I spoke, a slow, hard smile spread across his face. "You're a grunt, aren't you?" he asked. "Army," I confirmed. "Signal Corps." "Marine Recon," he said, tapping his chest. "Knew it. You got that look. Count me in, Major. Whatever you need." That woman told me my flag was jingoistic and intimidating to our more diverse residents. I've been waiting for a chance to fight back properly. He was my first recruit. My second came in the form of Eleanor Vance, a retired librarian who lived 2 doors down from me. She was being hounded by Karen about the bird feeders in her backyard. Apparently they attracted undesirable avian elements, and the fallen seed was a violation of the yard cleanliness bylaws. Eleanor, a sweet woman in her late 70s, was terrified. The threatening letters had her convinced she was going to lose her home, a home she'd lived in for 30 years, long before the HOA even existed. I sat with her on her porch, reviewed her letters, and showed her my own file. I explained that Karen's threats were empty, designed to intimidate, not to stand up in court. "She's a bully, Eleanor," I said gently. "And the only way to deal with a bully is to stand up to her, together." By the end of the week, my small resistance cell had grown. I had Dave the Marine, Eleanor the librarian, the Garcia family with their illegal tomatoes, and even a young couple who had been cited because their toddler's brightly colored plastic slide was visible from the street. But my most important ally came from an unexpected source. I received an email one evening with the subject line, "Northgate HOA Overreach." It was from an Arthur Pendleton, a resident on the far side of the development. The email was brief. "Mr. Callahan, I've heard through the grapevine about your situation. I believe I can be of assistance. I was a litigator with a major firm for 40 years, specializing in contract and administrative law. It seems our esteemed President Vance may have finally picked a fight she cannot win. Let's talk." We met the next day at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood. Arthur was a tall, stooped man with sharp eyes and a tweed jacket that had seen better days. He listened intently as I laid out my case, spreading copies of my key documents across the small table. He read Karen's memo about my fake government papers and let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Oh, she put that in writing," and he said, a predatory gleam in his eye. "The sheer, unadulterated hubris. It's magnificent." He tapped my copy of the FEMA letter. "This is your queen," he said, pointing to the document. Then he tapped the copy of the PRB1 rule. "And this is your ace. Federal preemption is not a suggestion, it's a sledgehammer. She's not just violating a bylaw, she's breaking federal law. And by putting the HOA on the hook for it, she's breached her fiduciary duty to the community. This is no longer about your antenna, my friend. This is a coup." The word hung in the air between us. A coup. It sounded dramatic, but he was right. The objective was no longer just to defend my property. It was to remove Karen from power and restore sanity to the community she held hostage. With a seasoned lawyer now on our side, Project Retribution was about to move from reconnaissance to direct action. The first letter from Arthur Pendleton, Esquire, retired, to the Northgate Estates HOA Board of Directors landed like a precision-guided missile. Sent via courier to the HOA's management company and certified mail to each board member's home address, including Karen's, it was a thing of legal beauty. It was 4 pages long, single-spaced, and written in language that was both impeccably polite and brutally menacing. Arthur didn't bother with emotional appeals or subjective arguments. He simply laid out the facts in cold, hard, numbered paragraphs. Paragraph 1 detailed the installation of my antenna array and its critical public safety function, referencing the enclosed letter from FEMA. Paragraph 2 cited, verbatim, the relevant sections of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and FCC Rule P, RB1, explaining that these federal statutes expressly preempt any local or private covenants that would prohibit or impair the effective function of such installations. Paragraph 3 pointed to the HOA's own Architectural Review Committee's written approval of my plan, attaching a copy of the form. Paragraph 4 was the masterstroke. It cited a specific clause in the HOA's own master declaration, one I had missed but Arthur had found buried on page 87, Article 9, Section 12, Public Utility and Safety Easements. Nothing in these covenants shall be construed to prohibit the installation or maintenance of any structure or equipment necessary for the provision of public utilities, emergency services, or public safety as mandated by local, state, or federal authorities. Arthur had found a kill switch embedded in their own governing documents. They had, in their own fine print, created a carve-out for exactly my situation. The letter then moved from defense to offense. It stated that the fines being levied were illegal and unenforceable. It accused President Vance of tortious interference with my ability to perform my duties under a federal contract. It accused her of acting in bad faith by knowingly disregarding the evidence I had provided and misrepresenting the situation to the rest of the board. It stated that her actions constituted a breach of her fiduciary duty to the home owners by exposing the HOA to significant legal and financial liability. The letter concluded not with a request, but with a demand. We hereby demand that the Board of Directors immediately 1. Rescind all fines and violation notices issued to my client, Mr. Callahan. 2. Issue a formal written apology to Mr. Callahan for the harassment he has endured. 3. Cease and desist all further attempts to interfere with my client's federally protected activities. Failure to comply with these demands within 10 business days will result in the immediate filing of a lawsuit in the United States District Court against the Northgate Estates HOA and its board members, both as a corporate body and as individuals, seeking injunctive relief and punitive damages. Naming them as individuals was the twist of the knife. It meant their personal assets, not just the HOA's insurance policy, could be on the line. The response was swift, but not in the way we expected. There was no official letter back, no panicked phone call from the HOA's lawyer. Instead, Karen doubled down. 2 days after Arthur's letter was delivered, a new notice appeared on the community bulletin board by the pool. It was a special announcement from the president. It didn't mention me by name, but the target was unmistakable. Dear residents, it began, it has come to my attention that a certain homeowner is attempting to use legal-sounding threats and questionable government documents to circumvent our community's cherished rules, which are designed to protect our property values in aesthetic harmony. This individual has erected a massive industrial eyesore that poses a potential safety risk and lowers the desirability of our entire neighborhood. Be assured your board is standing firm against this attempt to bully our community. We will not be intimidated. We will use every tool at our disposal, including placing a lien and foreclosing on the property, to ensure compliance. A full presentation and vote on this matter will be the primary agenda item at our upcoming annual homeowners meeting in 3 weeks. Please plan to attend and make your voice heard. It was a declaration of war, not just on me, but on the rule of law itself. She was trying to turn it into a public spectacle, a show trial where she could whip up the uninformed residents into a mob and use their popular opinion to override federal law. Arthur was ecstatic when I read it to him over the phone. She's a gift, he cackled, an absolute unmitigated gift. She's just admitted in writing that she's intentionally disregarding legal counsel and federal statutes. She's framing the annual meeting as a referendum on a legal matter that is not subject to a popular vote. This is better than I could have dreamed. We don't have to drag her into the public square. She's building her own guillotine in the middle of it. The new plan was simple. We would let her have her show trial. We would let her stack the deck, rally her supporters, and prepare her grand speech. We would use the next 3 weeks to prepare our own presentation, not for the board, but for the entire community. We would turn her weapon, the public meeting, against her. We would transform her planned public shaming into a public expose of her own incompetence, corruption, and abuse of power. The annual meeting was no longer a threat. It was an opportunity. It was the kill zone. And Karen was marching straight into the middle of it, drunk on her own power and completely unaware of the ambush that awaited her. We began preparing our own information campaign, a dossier for every homeowner who would attend. This dossier would contain everything: the FEMA letter, the federal statutes, the HOA's own exculpatory bylaw, and, as a finishing touch, a collection of dated photographs of Karen's own numerous, flagrant bylaw violations. We were going to arm the entire community with the truth. The 3 weeks leading up to the annual homeowners meeting were a blur of meticulous preparation. Our small alliance met twice a week in Arthur's study, a room that smelled of old books and righteous indignation. The walls were lined with leather-bound legal texts, and a large mahogany desk was perpetually covered in our growing mountain of evidence. Arthur, in his element, orchestrated the strategy like a seasoned field marshal planning a decisive battle. Dave Jensen, the Marine, took on the role of our intelligence officer, discreetly canvassing the neighborhood, taking a pulse, and identifying residents who were sympathetic but too afraid to speak out. Yagi, the librarian with her decades of experience in research and organization, became our archivist, cross-referencing my photos of Karen's violations with the specific bylaw codes, creating an irrefutable matrix of hypocrisy. My job was to prepare the central presentation and to liaise with my own chain of command. I called my contact at FEMA, Regional Director Mark Michaels. Mark was a no-nonsense ex-Coast Guard captain who had seen it all. I'd worked with him on disaster relief efforts from Hurricane Katrina to the Joplin tornado. When I explained the situation, the HOA president, dismissing his official letter as a fake government paper and actively trying to force the removal of a designated emergency communications hub, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Let me get this straight, Jack," he finally said, his voice dangerously calm. "This woman is knowingly and willfully obstructing the deployment of a critical piece of national security infrastructure?" "That's the long and short of it, Mark," I replied. "She's holding a public meeting to try and get the neighborhood to vote to have me tear it down. Interfering with FEMA operations is a federal offense, Jack. A felony." "I'm aware," I said, "but I'm trying to handle this at the lowest possible level first. A federal lawsuit would be messy and time-consuming. I think we can neutralize the threat locally at this meeting, but it would be a hell of a lot more effective if I had some air support." There was another pause, and then I heard the sound of him tapping on a keyboard. "The Northgate Estates annual meeting," and he mused. "When and where?" I gave him the details. "I think," he said slowly, "my schedule might just be open. It's about time I made a community outreach visit to the region anyway. It's important for the public to understand the vital role our contractors and volunteers play in public safety. I'll see if I can bring a colleague or two, in uniform, of course." The final piece was in place. We now had the legal argument, the evidence of malfeasance, and a sitting FEMA director ready to testify on our behalf. Meanwhile, Karen was busy with her own preparations. She sent out 2 more community-wide emails. The first was a reminder of the meeting, with a bolded agenda item: vote on enforcement action for property at 1812 Oak Street. The second was a screed filled with fear-mongering rhetoric. She claimed my antenna was a documented health hazard, citing a debunked article from a conspiracy website about radio wave sickness. She claimed it would attract lightning strikes, endangering the entire neighborhood. She claimed my secret government contract meant I could be spying on my neighbor's Wi-Fi. It was a clumsy, desperate attempt to poison the well, to paint me as a dangerous outsider. What she didn't realize was that with every new baseless accusation, she was digging her own hole deeper. Arthur had us meticulously print and save each email. It's called defamation per se, he explained with a grin, making false statements that harm someone's profession or reputation. It's just another log for the fire. The day before the meeting, we assembled our information packets. Each one was a simple two-pocket folder. On the left side, we placed copies of the key legal documents: Arthur's letter, the FEMA letter, the relevant federal and HOA bylaws. On the right side, we placed the gallery of shame, a dozen full-color photos of Karen's property, with her gnomes, her flamingo, her illegal mailbox, and her overgrown hedges, each one neatly captioned with the specific bylaw it violated. We made 75 copies, enough for every household we expected to attend. The final touch was a cover sheet, a simple letter to our neighbors. It read, "Dear neighbor, the enclosed documents are for your information. We believe in transparency and the rule of law. We trust you to review the facts and make your own informed decision. Sincerely, your neighbors for a fair HOA." We didn't sign our names. We wanted the documents to speak for themselves. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Dave and I, along with the Garcia's teenage son, moved through the neighborhood like a special ops team, placing a folder on the doorstep of every home. It was a silent, preemptive information strike. By the time Karen woke up the next morning, the entire community would have the full, unvarnished truth in their hands. The battlefield had been prepped. The ambush was set. All that was left was for the enemy to walk into it. As I went to bed that night, I felt a profound sense of calm. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question was how spectacularly Karen would manage to self-destruct when the lights came on. The Northgate Estates annual homeowners meeting was held in the clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the adjacent pool. In desperation, the air was thick with a tense, expectant energy. By 7 o'clock, every one of the 50 folding chairs was filled, and residents were standing along the back and side walls. I saw faces I recognized from my walks: the Hendersons, the Garcias, Eleanor Vance, who gave me a small, encouraging nod. Many of them were clutching the information packets we had distributed the night before, their contents already dog-eared and discussed. I took a seat in the front row with Arthur at my side. Dave Jensen stood like a sentinel near the back door, his arms crossed over his massive chest. At precisely 7:05 p.m., Karen Vance made her grand entrance. She strode to the flimsy particle board lectern at the front of the room, flanked by the two other board members, Mildred Perkins, the mousy secretary, and a man I recognize as Bob, the treasurer, who looked profoundly uncomfortable, like a man on his way to his own execution. Karen beamed at the crowd, radiating a confidence that was completely detached from the reality of the room. She was holding her clipboard, her weapon of choice, and she tapped the microphone with a flourish. "Welcome, everyone," she boomed, her voice echoing slightly in the poorly designed room. "So wonderful to see such a fantastic turnout. It shows how much you all care about our beautiful community." She launched into a 15-minute monologue of self-congratulation, detailing the board's accomplishments over the past year: the successful negotiation of a new landscaping contract, the timely resurfacing of the tennis courts, the implementation of a stricter parking enforcement policy. The crowd listened with a kind of polite restlessness. Finally, she got to the main event. Her smile tightened, and her expression shifted from magnanimous leader to stern disciplinarian. "And now," she said, her voice dropping for dramatic effect, "we must address a very serious issue, a threat to the harmony and property values of our entire community." She didn't use my name, but she turned and pointed a single accusatory finger directly at me. "A certain resident has seen fit to erect an enormous industrial-grade antenna tower in flagrant violation of our covenants." A low murmur went through the crowd. I remained perfectly still, my face a neutral mask. "This resident," she continued, her voice rising with manufactured outrage, "has refused to comply with multiple notices. He has ignored our generous offers to resolve this matter amicably. Instead, he has responded with threats and a flood of what I can only describe as fraudulent government paperwork designed to intimidate your volunteer board members. This was it, her moment of peak hubris. Arthur leaned over and whispered, "She's hanging herself with her own rope. It's glorious." Karen plowed ahead. "This structure is an eyesore, a safety hazard, and a slap in the face to every resident who follows the rules. Therefore, the board is proposing an immediate and final enforcement action. We will be voting tonight to place a special assessment on the property for the full amount of the accrued fines, which now total over $32,000, and to authorize our legal counsel to immediately place a lien on the property and begin foreclosure proceedings if the structure is not removed within 7 days." The room erupted, not with the applause Karen was clearly expecting, but with a cacophony of shocked and angry voices. A man in the back shouted, "Foreclosure? Are you insane?" A woman near the front held up our information packet. "What about this letter from FEMA? Is that fraudulent too?" Karen's composure finally cracked. Her face flushed a deep, mottled red. "That is not up for discussion," she shrieked, banging the lectern with her clipboard. "This is a simple vote on whether we enforce our own rules." "I believe the homeowner has a right to be heard." A calm, authoritative voice cut through the noise. It was Arthur, who had risen slowly to his feet. Every eye in the room turned to him. Karen glared. "And who are you?" "I am Arthur Pendleton," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "A resident of this community for 22 years. I am also Mr. Callahan's legal counsel." The word counsel sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the room. Karen sputtered, "This is not a courtroom. You have no standing here." "On the contrary," Arthur replied smoothly, "this is precisely the forum for this discussion, since you, Madam President, chose to make it one. My client has a right to address the Assembly as per Robert's Rules of Order, which this HOA's charter explicitly adopts for all public meetings." He had her. She was trapped by the very procedural rules she loved to weaponize. Defeated, she spat out, "Fine, he can have 5 minutes." I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I didn't stand at the lectern. I stood before it, placing myself on the same level as my neighbors. I looked out at the sea of faces, making eye contact with as many as I could. "Good evening," and I began, my voice steady and clear. "My name is Jack Callahan. I'm a 30-year veteran of the United States Army, and I'm your neighbor. I'm not going to take 5 minutes of your time. I only need 1. I held up the letter from FEMA. "This is a letter from my superior at the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It explains that the equipment at my home is part of a national emergency communications network. When a hurricane hits, when the power goes out, when the cell towers fall, this equipment is what allows police, fire, and medical first responders to save lives. President Vance has called this letter, and my FCC license, fake government papers. She has, in writing, accused me of fraud." I paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "I have a guest with me tonight who would like to address that accusation." I turned toward the back of the room. "Director Michaels, if you would." The back doors opened and 2 men entered. Both were wearing the official dark blue FEMA duty uniform, complete with insignia and credentials. The man in the lead was Mark Michaels, his face set in a grim, determined expression. The residents parted like the Red Sea as they strode to the front of the room. The silence was absolute. Karen's jaw hung open, her face a pale, slack mask of disbelief. Mark stopped beside me and turned to face her. His voice was quiet, but it resonated with the unmistakable authority of a man who commanded immense resources and respect. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes boring into hers, "I am Regional Director Mark Michaels of the United States Department of Homeland Security, Federal Emergency Management Agency. I can assure you my letterhead is quite real. And so is the federal statute that makes it a felony to interfere with the operations of a designated FEMA facility." The entire room seemed to gasp as one. Karen Vance, HOA president, had just been confronted by a director from the Department of Homeland Security in a public meeting. The ambush was complete. The trap had been sprung. Her reign of terror was officially over. The sight of the 2 uniformed federal officials standing at the front of the room had a profound and immediate effect on the atmosphere. The anger and confusion in the crowd solidified into a single unified wave of stunned silence, all of it directed at the woman behind the lectern. Karen Vance looked as though she'd been struck by lightning. Her face had gone from crimson rage to a pasty, sickly white. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. She looked from Director Michaels to me and then out at the sea of faces staring at her, many of them now holding up our information packets like indictments. Director Michaels didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke with the calm, chilling precision of someone who is accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. For the record, he continued, addressing the entire room but never taking his eyes off Karen, Major Callahan is one of our most valued contractors. The equipment he maintains is not a hobby. It is a vital component of the disaster preparedness infrastructure for this entire state. In the event of a catastrophic communications failure, his station becomes a primary hub, a lifeline for coordinating search and rescue, medical evacuations, and the distribution of essential supplies. Your president's attempts to force its removal are not just a violation of your own bylaws and federal law, they are a direct threat to the safety and well-being of every citizen in this region. He let that statement hang in the air, each word a hammer blow against Karen's authority. Then he turned his attention to Bob, the treasurer, and Mildred, the secretary, who both looked like they were trying to physically shrink into their chairs. And for the rest of the board, Michael said, his tone hardening, I would strongly advise you to consult with competent legal counsel. By allowing your president to pursue this reckless course of action, you have exposed this homeowners association to a federal lawsuit that it cannot possibly win. The Department of Justice does not take kindly to the obstruction of its federal agencies. Arthur chose that moment to step forward. On that note, Director, he said, his voice dripping with courtroom gravitas, allow me to add that we have also documented a clear pattern of selective enforcement, harassment, and breach of fiduciary duty on the part of President Vance. He gestured to the crowd. Ask Mr. Jensen why he is fined for flying the American flag. Ask Mrs. Vance why she is threatened for feeding the birds. Ask the Garcias why their vegetable garden is a crime. He then turned and pointed a long, bony finger at Karen, and then asked President Vance why her own property is littered with violations, from her non-compliant mailbox to her tacky lawn ornaments. He held up the photo sheet from our packet. A projector screen had been set up for the treasurer's budget presentation, and Dave Jensen, with perfect timing, had connected a laptop. He clicked a button, and a massive, high-resolution image of Karen's drunken gnome collection filled the screen behind the board members. The room exploded in a wave of laughter and angry shouts. It was a perfect, humiliating punctuation to her downfall. This isn't about bylaws, Dave Jensen's voice boomed from the back of the room. This is about a bully who uses the rules to punish anyone she doesn't like. We've all seen it. A chorus of yes, and that's right, echoed through the clubhouse. The dam of fear and intimidation that Karen had built over the years had finally broken. One by one, people stood up to voice their own grievances, stories of petty tyrannies and ridiculous fines that had been bottled up for years. Karen stood frozen amidst the chaos, her face a grotesque canvas of shock, fury, and utter defeat. Her power, which was always an illusion built on bluff and bluster, had evaporated in the span of 10 minutes. The HOA's lawyer, a slick-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who had been lurking near the back, was now seen discreetly gathering his briefcase and slipping out the side door, wanting no part of the impending legal catastrophe. Finally, Mr. Abernathy, the elderly widower with the unapproved walker ramp, slowly got to his feet, leaning heavily on a cane. The room fell silent as he spoke, his voice frail but clear. I think, he said, that we have had enough. I would like to make a motion under Article 3, Section 5 of our Charter for the immediate recall and removal of Karen Vance from the position of President and from the Board of Directors for cause. Second, shouted a dozen voices at once. Karen finally found her voice, a high-pitched shriek of denial. You can't do this! This is illegal! This meeting is about the antenna! No, Karen, Mildred Perkins, the timid secretary said, finding a spine for the first time in what was probably a decade. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice firm. This meeting is about you. I vote aye on the motion to remove you. Aye, said Bob, the treasurer, looking immensely relieved. The motion was then put to the homeowners. A forest of hands shot up in favor of removal. When the call came for nays, only one hand remained down. Karen's. She stood alone, publicly and overwhelmingly repudiated by the very people she sought to rule. Her reign was over. She stared out at the crowd, her face utterly blank. Then she threw her clipboard onto the lectern with a loud clatter, turned without a word, and stormed out of the room, the sound of the clubhouse door slamming shut behind her like a final, pathetic exclamation point. The room erupted in applause, not of triumph, but of profound collective relief. In the immediate aftermath of Karen's spectacular public immolation, the atmosphere in the clubhouse transformed. The tension that had choked the room for an hour dissipated, replaced by a sense of communal liberation. Neighbors who had previously only exchanged polite nods were now clapping each other on the back, sharing stories of their own run-ins with the fallen president. Bob, the treasurer, now the acting board president, looked shell-shocked but visibly relieved. He came over to shake my hand and then Director Michaels. On behalf of the HOA, he said, his voice still a bit shaky, I want to formally and sincerely apologize. To you, Major Callahan, for the harassment, and to you, Director Michaels, for the unbelievable ignorance. Apology accepted, I said simply. Let's just make sure this doesn't happen again. It won't, Mildred Perkins chimed in, her face flushed with newfound courage. Our first order of business at the next board meeting will be to rescind every fine issued by Karen in the last year that wasn't related to a genuine safety issue. And we'll be sending a letter of apology to every resident affected. Director Michaels gave them a stern but approving nod. A wise decision. I trust we'll have no further issues with Major Callahan's facility. He handed Bob his official business card. If you or your new board have any questions about our operations or federal regulations, you call me directly. We are happy to be good neighbors, but we must be allowed to do our job. With that, he and his colleague took their leave, their mission accomplished. Their presence had been the ultimate trump card, a show of force so overwhelming that it had collapsed Karen's entire house of cards. The rest of the meeting was a blur of productive, collaborative energy. A special election was scheduled to fill the vacant board seat. A motion was passed to have the HOA's governing documents reviewed by a new independent law firm to ensure they complied with state and federal law, and to remove the vague, subjective clauses that Karen had so effectively weaponized. People were talking, laughing, and planning. It felt like a town square after a long, oppressive regime had been toppled. Arthur, Dave, Eleanor, and I gathered by the now empty lectern. Well, Arthur said, a deep satisfaction in his voice, I must say that was more entertaining than 90% of my actual trials. You did good, Major. We did good, I corrected him, looking at the small group that had formed the core of the resistance. This wouldn't have happened without all of us. The next morning, a work crew from the HOA's landscaping company arrived at my house. I was initially wary, but the foreman came to my door, cap in hand. Mr. Callahan? Bob from the HOA sent us. Said you mentioned you were open to some landscaping to screen the tower base. Said the HOA would be happy to cover the cost. It was a peace offering and a welcome one. By the end of the day, a tasteful ring of fast-growing arborvitae had been planted around the concrete pad, softening its appearance from the street without impeding its function in any way. It was the reasonable accommodation I had offered from the very beginning. A week later, a moving truck pulled up to 1428 Azalea Lane. Karen was leaving. She didn't have a for sale sign on her lawn for long. Rumor had it she sold the house in a private, off-market deal into a buyer who was happy to get it at a slight discount for a quick, quiet closing. I saw her only once during the process. She was standing in her driveway, directing the movers with a scowl, her collection of gnomes and her pink flamingo already packed away in boxes. Our eyes met for a brief second across the street. There was no remorse in her gaze, only a flat, bitter resentment. She turned away without a word. I didn't feel triumph, just a quiet sense of pity. Her entire world, the petty kingdom she had built, had crumbled because she couldn't comprehend a power greater than her own clipboard. Her departure was the final act, the closing of a chapter for the entire community. The fear she had cultivated was replaced by a renewed sense of neighborliness. The HOA board, under Bob's reluctant but steady leadership, became a far more reasonable and transparent organization. The ridiculous violation notices stopped. People put their basketball hoops back up. The Garcias expanded their tomato garden. Dave Jensen's flag flew proudly without a fine in sight. My antenna array, once the source of so much conflict, became something of a local landmark. People would point it out to visitors, not as an eyesore, but with a certain pride. That's the FEMA tower, they'd say. Belongs to a retired Army major. He keeps us safe. My quiet life had been interrupted, but the battle had been necessary. It had forged new friendships and reminded an entire community that the purpose of rules is to serve the people, not to empower tyrants. It was a lesson that Northgate Estates would not soon forget. Several months passed, and life in Northgate Estates settled into the peaceful rhythm I had originally hoped for. The fall gave way to a crisp, cold winter, and the new HOA board, true to its word, proved to be a model of quiet competence. They held open meetings, communicated clearly, and focused on maintaining the community's actual infrastructure rather than policing its residents' personal tastes. My antenna array became just another part of the landscape. The arbor vitae grew thick and green around its base, and the daily hum of my equipment in the workshop was a comforting background noise. I spent my days running drills, participating in national communication exercises, and ensuring every piece of my gear was perfectly maintained and ready at a moment's notice. The Karen file was retired to a box in the back of my office closet, a thick monument to a battle won. Then came the storm. The forecast had been predicting a major ice storm for days, and this time, the meteorologist got it right. It began as a cold, driving rain in the late afternoon, but as the temperature plummeted after sunset, every drop began to freeze on contact. Tree branches, power lines, and roads were quickly encased in a growing sheath of clear, heavy ice. The lights in our house flickered once, twice, and then went out with a final definitive saw. The neighborhood was plunged into a deep, silent darkness, broken only by the eerie, crystalline glow of the ice-coated world outside and the increasingly frequent, sharp crack of tree limbs giving way under the immense weight. My backup generator kicked on automatically, its steady thrum a reassuring sound in the sudden quiet. While Sarah lit candles and checked on our emergency supplies, I went to my office, my communications center. The hum of the servers, the glow of the monitors, and the soft static from the speakers were my call to action. My primary duty phone, a satellite phone that bypassed all local infrastructure, rang almost immediately. It was the County Emergency Operations Center. Northgate Station, this is County EOC. We have a full grid-down situation. All landlines and cell towers in the northern half of the county are dark. We are switching to emergency comms protocol. Are you online? EOC, this is Northgate Station, I replied, my voice calm and professional as I flipped a series of switches on my console. I am fully operational, all systems green, ready to receive and relay. For the next 72 hours, I lived in that chair. My little corner of a quiet suburban house became the nerve center for a massive emergency response. Through my antennas, the ones Karen had called a godforsaken metal monstrosity, flowed the lifeblood of a community in crisis. I relayed dispatch calls for paramedics trying to reach an elderly man with a heart condition on an impassable road. I coordinated the deployment of National Guard units with chainsaws to clear fallen trees from the main arteries into the city. I patched the fire chief, stuck at a remote station, through to his battalion commander spread across the county. I provided a communications link for the power company crews, helping them identify and isolate the most critical line breaks. Sarah became my support crew, keeping me supplied with hot coffee and sandwiches, and printing out the maps and damage reports that streamed into my inbox via a satellite internet link. Through my window, I could see the dark, silent houses of my neighbors, and I felt a profound sense of purpose. This was it. This was why I had fought so hard. This was the reason the tower had to stand. On the third day, as the rain finally subsided and the beleaguered power crews began to make progress, I got a call on the local VHF channel I kept monitored. It wasn't an official call, just a voice I recognized. "Hey, Jack, you there? It's Dave Jensen." His voice was tinny, coming from a small handheld radio. "Loud and clear, Dave," I replied. "You okay over there?" "We're fine, man," he said. "Big branch took out part of my fence, but the house is good. Listen, the reason I'm calling, my brother-in-law is a firefighter over in the next town. He just told me something I thought you should hear. He said the only reason they were able to coordinate the response to that big apartment fire last night was because of some Army guy's radio setup that was patching them through to the county. He said you saved lives, Jack." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Just doing my job, Dave." "Yeah, well," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm looking out my window right now at that eyesore of yours. And you know what? It's the most beautiful damn thing in this whole neighborhood." We sat in silence for a moment. The crackle of the radio the only sound. In that moment, the entire ordeal, the letters, the fines, the public meeting, the fight, it all crystallized into a single clear point of victory. It wasn't just about winning an argument with a petty tyrant. It was about defending my purpose. It was about ensuring that when the lights went out and the world went silent, I could still be a voice in the dark, a link in a chain that held the community together. Later that afternoon, the power finally flickered back on in our neighborhood. Lights came on in windows and the hum of refrigerators and furnaces returned. My job was done. I powered down the main transmitters, ran a final diagnostic, and made my report to the EOC. As I finally leaned back in my chair, exhausted but deeply satisfied, I looked out the window at my antenna tower, its aluminum frame stark against the gray winter sky. It wasn't unsightly, it wasn't a monstrosity, it was a sentinel, and it was here to stay.